This is the last talk of the New Books on Japan series for the MJHA. So we're really delighted to have Simon Avenell here, who is a professor in the School of Culture, History and Language at Australian National University. He is the author of several books. I remember when he was giving introductory remarks for Tetsumoto Suzuki back in the fall, that he said that she took very seriously the responsibility to produce scholarship and be prolific, and Simon has really followed in her footsteps. He's the author of Making Japanese Citizens, Civil Society and the Mythology of the Shimin in Postwar Japan, 2010. Transnational Japan, the Global Environmental Movement, 2017. And today's book is Asia and Postwar Japan, Deimperialization, Civic Activism and National Identity, published with Harvard University Asia Center, 2022. He's also the editor of numerous volumes on Postwar Japan, including Reconsidering Postwar Japanese History, a handbook, which came out in 2023, and he co-edited Transnational Civil Society in Asia, the Potential Grassroots Regionalization in 2021. We're also delighted to have Robert Hoppens as today's discussant. He is Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Robert Hoppens is the author of The China Problem in Postwar Japan, National Identity and Sino-Japanese Relations. So we're very excited to have two of these scholars and experts on postwar Japan and Japanese relations to Asia. And so I would like to hand it over to Simon. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Seiji. Now, just give me a second to share my screen. Yes. All right, so good morning, everybody. Good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. Thank you so much for joining this, joining my talk. It's really good to see some old friends out there in the audience. Hello to everybody. Also, some new faces as well. So what I would like to do today is just begin talking briefly about, I guess, about the aims I had in writing the book, the theoretical framework that I employed, as well as some of the background that actually led me to kind of set out on the project a few years ago. And following that, I'll jump into some very brief snapshots of the episodes that I used to build my historical narrative throughout the work. So first things first, what is this book about? I guess at the very broadest level, the book is about, the relationship between Japan and Asia in the wake of empire. Asia, of course, as a geographical space of people and nation states whose pasts were intimately linked to Japan as a result of colonial empire and militarism. But also Asia, I guess, as an idea which had its own sort of long history within the intellectual trajectory of modern Japan. And specifically, I was interested in the question of, how progressives in former colonial and militarist nations like Japan do or, do not come to terms with their nation's past of transgression and invasion on the level of both mentalities and also on the level of activism for many of them. So in the context of this work, I try to treat the category of progressives as expansively as possible. And in fact, one thing that I really try to show is how the configuration of this group changes and grows over time, directly in response to their awakening to this Asia problem. And I suppose my general assumption going into the project was that if any group within Japan was going to be receptive to facing and dealing with the country's tainted past in Asia, then it would be progressives. And in fact, progressives, I think, kind of, in a sense, represent a kind of barometer of the extent to which a society more generally is engaging with the past. Progressives arguably represent the limits of engagement at any particular moment. So my sense was that I could use the post-war experience of progressives and their conceptualizations and imaginations of Asia, you know, as a, I guess, you know, I guess as a way to say something about the broader historical process of engaging with the past in post-war Japan, and this was the larger framework that I had in mind. Now, Seiji asked me if I could briefly talk about my intellectual evolution to this book from my earlier works. Well, and I was thinking, you know, intellectual evolution is probably a bit too grand a term for somebody like me, and you know, I sort of just I hit on topics that I find interesting, and they sort of snowball into projects. But looking back, I guess I can see certain continuities to what I've done earlier. In terms of approach, I guess I would classify myself as a historian of ideas, concepts, and mentalities. So I'm always very interested in trying to understand how people and groups construct ideas, how ideas change and are changed over time, and also how ideas influence what people and groups, you know, actually do and how they think, you know, their mentalities. So, you know, on this level, I've been influenced, you know, by sociological theories on social constructionism and, for example, ideational framing in social movements. So in my first work, I looked at constructions, contestations and deployments of the concept of the citizen. In the second book, I turned to the ways activists and intellectuals deployed ideas about industrial pollution and the environment. And in this book, I turned to the uses of Asia. And I guess another connection to my earlier work is an interest in progressive intellectuals, civic activists, and civil society in Japan, and particularly how these groups and spheres have evolved over time. And this connects closely to why I wanted to focus on Asia in this book, because in my earlier two works, I guess I kept running into instances of intellectuals and activists facing questions about Asia and the past. And this was even in the context of environmental movements. So the theme of progressives and Asia had sort of been at the back of my mind for quite a few years. And I guess one other continuity to my earlier work would be my focus on Japan after 1945, which has been the case for all three books. I've been really interested in trying to understand the historical dynamics of this period. For example, the watersheds, the phases, continuities, the external and internal influences. You know, the question, I guess, how do we deal with this chunk of history? And growing out of my earlier work on social movements and transnational environmental activism, I began to sense that maybe there are, you know, really important aspects of the post-war experience in Japan that might be better elucidated through a foregrounding of Asia, whether that be on the conceptual level or in terms of, say, transnational connections between Japanese progressives and those in other countries like South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and elsewhere. You know, in other words, bringing the variables of Asia and Asian interactions to the foreground of post-war Japanese history to see what we might learn. So the other aim of the book, I guess, was to try and build on the insights of earlier research, not only mine, research, you know, for example, by Robert as well, in I guess trying to construct a mosaic of post-war Japanese history through the lens of Asia. So that's a kind of roadmap of my journey to this book, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. So the theoretical tool that I chose to frame this examination of progressives is the notion of deimperialization. Now, I guess I could quite easily have used the term decolonization, but I I made a conscious decision to deploy the term because I really wanted to emphasize a couple of things. First and foremost, of course, my focus is on the mentalities and actions of the defunct colonizer. In other words, the question of how the former colonizer deals with the afterlife, if you will, of colonial empire. And I think the notion of deimperialization signals this desire on my part to focus in that direction. But secondly, I also felt that deimperialization was I guess, an appropriate term in the context of how Asia has been imagined more generally in modern Japan. And as I'm sure you all know, even before Japan set out on empire building in the late 19th century, Asia really figured prominently in the consciousness of political leaders and intellectuals, mostly, of course, in a negative or a strategic way. And as I try to argue in the book, I think this sense of superiority over and discrimination toward Asia even infiltrated the mentalities of progressives. So on this level, the idea of deimperialization also framed my attempt to try and tease open this really complicated mindset of progressives toward Asia, and the difficult process through which they tried to eradicate this mentality after 1945. And I guess a key point that I tried to make is that it took progressives a great many years to connect the problem of war responsibility, this idea of responsibility, including their own, to any kind of systematic engagement with the problem of colonial empire. And moreover, it took time for progressives to face the unconscious prejudices and biases toward Asia contained within their own mentalities, and indeed within their own methodologies as well. Okay, so with that background in mind, let me talk a little bit about the content of the book and some of the events and phases that I explore. As you can see from this slide here, I divide the history of deimperialization into 6 phases or episodes, beginning immediately after war's end and stretching through the new millennium. And in each phase, I try to unpack how progressives were dealing with the Asia problem, as I call it, what obstacles they encountered, how they did or did not overcome these, and what progress, if any, was made at all. So the beginning for me is the moment of defeat and occupation after 1945, which, in terms of Japan's relationship with Asia, represented both a kind of fundamental disjuncture with the region, the loss of empire essentially overnight, but also, as I've intimated, a continuity in terms of internalized biases toward both the idea of and also the geographical spaces of Asia. And I see the American-led occupation as a particularly important factor in delaying any systematic engagement with the problem of colonial empire in early post-war Japan. Primarily, of course, because of the occupation's policies of what might be called de-Asianization. In other words, the early occupation years were about, first, I guess, removing as many colonial subjects as possible from Japan. Also kind of fumigating memories of the former colonies. And thirdly, kind of recreating Japan around a notion of a kind of homogeneous, democratic ethnic nation, hermetically sealed within its borders and duly subservient to its American master. As a result of this, former colonial subjects from Korea and Taiwan who chose to stay in Japan or were unable to return to their homelands for various reasons were systematically peripheralized in this process of de-Asianization, made invisible in a sense where they had not been so before. But what I tried to emphasize about these early post-war years from around 1945 to 1950 is that progressives themselves also contributed fundamentally to this process of de-Asianization. And, quite ironically, this unfolded in the process of them facing the issue of war defeat and war responsibility. Let me explain a little bit more what I mean. In the early post-war years, progressive intellectuals expended a great deal of energy trying to explain why Japan's modern history had sort of arrived at the tragic conclusion of absolute defeat and destruction. Numerous explanations are put forward, by Marxist and modernist liberals, but what most agreed on, I think, was that the war had happened because of deficiencies within either, the Japanese psyche or within Japanese social and political institutions, or, within all of these. And a tool that many intellectuals used at the time to describe these deficiencies was the notion of Asian backwardness or stagnation. And, it was quite surprising to me to discover how often this notion of Japan's kind of devastating Asiaticness appears in early post-war discussions of responsibility. For example, early on, the political thinker Maruyama Masao, initially presents China as stagnant. Similarly, the sociologist Kawashima Takeyoshi talks about, the hierarchical Asiatic aspects of Japan's social structure. And similarly, again, the economic historian Otsuka Hisao argued that the Asiatic elements of the Japanese psyche had impeded the development of a modern human type in the country. So, as you can see, there's a really fascinating trans-war continuity here. Just as Asia was kind of seen and utilized as an inferior other or an internalized obstacle in the pre-war, in the post-war, at least early on, Asia is once again deployed to explain the tragedy of defeat by some. That is, if only the Japanese had managed to expunge their Asiatic mentalities, this great tragedy could have been avoided. So my point here is that negative attitudes toward Asia among progressives themselves kind of complement the de-Asianization unfolding under the occupation, in turn pushing the problem of colonial empire off the radar screen for a while. But things begin to change, albeit slowly, from around the late 1940s, I think, and more so throughout the early to mid-1950s. What I see happening in the early 1950s in progressive Japanese thinking about Asia is a shift from an ideology of Asiatic stagnation to a kind of I guess, an upbeat idealism of Asian and third world liberation and revolution. And of course, it's quite obvious why this happens. We have, the Communist Revolution in China in 1949, followed by the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, and the rise of the non-aligned movement, symbolized, most graphically in the Bandung Conference of 1955, and figures like Mao, Nehru, Sukarno, and Zhou Enlai. Now, I think the combined effect of these international events and personalities is to push many Japanese progressives to begin to abandon their assumptions about Asian backwardness in favor of a more positive vision of Asia as liberation. And in this section of the book, I explore the writings of thinkers like the historian Uehara Senroku, Takeuchi Yoshimi, and Shimizu Ikutaro, all of whom start to paint a very different picture of Asia. And even into kind of influential intellectuals like Maruyama Masao begin to walk back from their earlier criticisms of Chinese culture, as backward. And in fact, for some, like the sinologist Takeuchi Yoshimi, communist China actually becomes a kind of model of successful non-Western modernity compared to what he sees as Japan's failed modernity based on a kind of mimicry of the West. Also very interesting is work by Uehara Senroku and other historians who reject Eurocentric historiography and try to write a new world history in which peoples from Asia, Africa, and Latin America are sort of repositioned as the subjects of world history. And I think feeding into this shift in mentality is the ongoing reality of what many progressives, like Shimizu, for example, see as America's neo-imperial colonization of Japan, with its many military bases scattered across the archipelago. In this context, some progressives begin to see their country in a similar situation to the other colonized or decolonizing nations in the non-aligned movement. So, my suggestion is that around the early 1950s, the image of Asia begins to transform. And of course, one of the ironies here is that at this point in time, at least, progressives quite comfortably imagine Japan as a member of the colonized nations. Not all of them, but some of them do. So the question of Japan's imperial past is avoided. Although there are some exceptions I can talk about later. Nonetheless, my argument is that the 1950s are a really important moment in overcoming the process of de-Asianization of the early post-war years, and importantly, in repositioning Asia positively in the minds of some Japanese progressives, and I see this as a really significant basis for subsequent deimperialization. All right, so then what happens? Well, I argue that things really start to get interesting in terms of deimperialization. In other words, facing the question of colonial empire from around the late 1950s. As you can see on the slide, there are a number of incidents and events involving discrimination against Korean residents in Japan, as well as international developments such as the mass exodus of Koreans from Japan to North Korea in 1959, and of course, negotiations leading up to the Japan-South Korea Normalization Treaty of 1965. Now, what I try to do in this part of my narrative is show how the ethnic nationalism that Japanese progressives developed in response to their lionization of the non-aligned movement in the 1950s was gradually supplemented by a discourse on ethnic responsibility. To put it simply, in the early 1950s, Japanese progressives had projected their anti-Americanism through the lens of Asian ethnic nationalism. But toward the end of the decade, and with the awakening to minority issues among some in Japan, certain progressives, I think, feel obligated to address the issue of the Japanese people's ethnic responsibility to other ethnicities contained within the nation. And so to kind of drill down into this emergent discourse on ethnic responsibility, one case, really fascinating case that I look at is that of Lee Jin-woo, whose Japanese name was Kaneko Shizuo, a 20-year-old Korean born and raised in Japan, who in 1958 is arrested for the rape and brutal murder of 2 women in downtown Tokyo. Now, in response, several activists and intellectuals started a movement in support of Lee as he prepared for his trial. Now, Lee, in fact, told them that he didn't want any support at all and that he would be pleading guilty, but the group insisted that they were going to help him. Now, I won't go into the details of this incident. Please do take a look at the book if you're interested, and there are also a number of books in Japanese as well. What I want to emphasize, however, is how Japanese progressives engaged with Lee and his predicament. For his part, Lee told the court that his crimes were not based on any kind of ethnic rage over, the discrimination he had faced growing up in Japan, but rather out of a kind of simple desire to do something evil. But for the progressives who became his advocates, both in the media and also in the court, Lee Jin-woo was sort of emblematic of the deep-seated discrimination toward ethnic minorities in Japan. And accordingly, they made the really provocative argument that this life of discrimination should be considered as a mitigating factor in determining the punishment for his crimes. As the philosopher Tsurumi Shunsuke and others later described it, the crimes of Koreans and other minorities in Japan should in fact be understood as counter crimes, or kind of crimes in response to the original crimes, or the original sins of the Japanese against them. Now, of course, needless to say, such arguments had almost no influence publicly or in the courts. Lee was actually sentenced to death and he was promptly executed. But my argument is that the incident had important ramifications in progressive circles at the time. To begin with, I think it represented more or less one of the first times that Japanese progressives had mobilized for a minority group in the post-war era. Moreover, addressing the question of discrimination against a Korean in Japan quite seamlessly led to an investigation into the unresolved history of Japanese colonial empire in Korea, and more generally, discrimination toward Koreans and other Asians throughout modern Japanese history. So, we're arguably standing at the starting line of deimperialization in Japan around 1960, some 15 or so years after the war. And this is only among a small group of progressives. So, you can see that it's going to be a long and rather difficult process. Nonetheless, for me, this incident represents quite an important breakthrough for Japanese progressives, in the late 1950s. So from this launch pad, I guess I then really used the remaining episodes of my narrative in the book to show how the process of deimperialization sort of seeps into every nook and cranny of progressive thought and activism over the coming decades. And indeed, the position and comprehension of Asia in the progressive mentality as expressed in scholarship, activism, and public advocacy changes quite noticeably. And as you can see here on the slide, in this section of the book, I look closely at social movements and intellectual developments in the 1960s and early 70s. A period of heightened social tensions and protest among citizen activists and students in Japan, and indeed in many other parts of the world as well. For example, the Vietnam War from 1965 becomes another really important moment for Japanese progressives to face the task of deimperialization. Of course, with the commencement of the Vietnam War, American military bases in Okinawa become the staging grounds for B-52 bombing raids on North Vietnam. And being one of the first televised wars, the images of the damage inflicted on the Vietnamese people really shocked many Japanese people. And the shock was made even worse by the reality that Japan was complicit through the US-Japan Security Treaty. Japanese journalists like Honda Katsuichi also traveled to Vietnam to report on the war, and they let the Japanese public know about the deep involvement of Japan through the provision of special procurements to the US military. So at first, progressives are drawn to the movement, I guess, out of a sense of empathy for the Vietnamese who, were suffering at the hands of American bombing, just as their country had some 20 or so years ago. But thanks to the interventions of activists like Oda Makoto and others, they also over time came to be motivated by a sense of perpetration or aggression toward Vietnam, due, as I said, to their country's security treaty with the USA. And growing out of this emergent sense of perpetration toward Vietnam in the present led some to start asking serious questions about Japanese perpetration toward Asia in the past. Throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, we begin to see the appearance of various publications exploring Japanese colonial and wartime transgressions, such as the historian Ienaga Saburo's 1968 study of the Pacific War, in which, as many of you I'm sure know, he dealt in graphic detail with incidents like the Nanjing Massacre and Japan's biological warfare program at the infamous Unit 731 in Harbin. Similarly, in 1972, again, you can see it here on the slide, just prior to the normalization of relations between the PRC and Japan, Asahi newspaper journalist Honda Katsuichi travels to China, where he documents firsthand accounts of Japanese military barbarism during the war. And his reports were subsequently serialized in the Asahi newspaper and then published in book form under the title Travels in China. So Honda's work reaches a wider audience. And I also look at the awakening to Asia among some student activists in the late 1960s, with particular attention to the thought and activism of Tsumura Takashi. It's really interesting to me to see how students develop an internal critique of their kind of internationalist proletarian ideology in response to criticisms from Asian minority student groups in the late 1960s. Interestingly, also, as you can see here on the slide as well, Koreans in Japan also began to publish influential exposés on Japan's colonial past around this time. For example, in 1965, the historian Park Kyung-sik published a history of Korean forced migration and labor to Japan during the war. This is a really, really confronting book. So, the late 1960s and early 1970s sees the emergence of some very thorough progressive investigations into Japanese colonialism and militarism, stimulated very much by events such as the Vietnam War and the normalization of ties with the PRC. And I think because of the reach and influence of these activist intellectuals, the Asia problem, in other words, this problem of deimperialization around this time comes onto the radar screen of not only many more progressives, but also Japanese people more generally. And, in fact, the anti-Vietnam War movement was just the beginning of a flowering of grassroots engagements between Japanese activists and their counterparts throughout the region in the 1970s and beyond. So much so that I see the 1970s as the genesis of what I call the grassroots regionalization of Japanese civic activism. In other words, I guess it's a moment when progressives really began to connect the problem of deimperialization ever more directly to an urgent problem, an urgent program, I should say, for understanding the region and also kind of trying to build substantive ties with other Asian people. As I've explained, up until this point, Japanese progressives had been slowly awakening to the kind of necessity to engage with the past of colonialism and militarism in Asia. But their direct connections with Asian activists and intellectuals in other countries, or even with minorities in Japan, had been quite limited. But this situation, I think, began to change quite noticeably in the 1970s. And to illustrate this in the book, I explore a number of transnational movements Japanese activists became involved in with other activists throughout the region in the 1970s, such as mobilizations opposing Japanese sex tourism and industrial pollution in countries like South Korea, the Philippines, and Thailand. I also look at activist involvement in movements for democratization, particularly in South Korea. So just to give you one example, the transnational movement to protest against Japanese sex tourism to Asia, particularly South Korea in the early 1970s, is a really interesting case in point. Japanese women's groups, together with Christian women's associations and university students in South Korea, mobilized together to try and put a stop to organized sex tours of Japanese businessmen to Seoul, Jeju, and other areas. And ultimately, they were successful, despite the close ties Park Chung-hee was trying to develop with Japanese conservatives and business leaders. Now, in the context of the process of deimperialization among Japanese progressives, transnational movements such as these, I think, were really important in a similar way that the Vietnam anti-Vietnam War movement had been. For the Japanese women involved in the movement, interaction with their South Korean counterparts really opened their eyes not only to Japanese transgressions in the present, but also in the past. And indeed, growing out of this movement, we see numerous initiatives among Japanese women historians to re-examine the complicity of Japanese women in Japan's colonial expansion. For example, as settlers in colonial Korea, Manchuria, Taiwan, and elsewhere. And actually, this had started a little bit earlier than this movement. And again, what we see here is a really important conceptual shift in understandings. I think for the most part, colonial settlers' memories of the past were built on a sense of victimization. They felt that the Japanese state had failed them, even betrayed them by encouraging them to relocate to the colonies, which were eventually lost. And to make matters worse, when they returned to Japan, they had sort of been forced to rebuild by themselves. So engagement in movements such as the anti-sex tourism mobilization exposed Japanese women activists to a new perspective on the past. Female settlers, some of them started to recognize, had perhaps also been complicit in the colonial project in myriad ways. So they were not only victims, they had also been perpetrators and aggressors. And needless to say, I think the combination of this historical awakening to colonial empire and the presence of sex tourism also opened up other troubling aspects for Japanese women activists, most specifically the so-called comfort woman issue, which they would begin to engage in earnest in later decades. So, we can see here how transnational activism, I guess, was promoting deimperialization. So, after I examine these transnational mobilizations of the 1970s, I turn attention to the process by which this process of deimperialization opened up some really exciting and innovative ways of understanding and interacting with Asia among Japanese progressives in the late 1970s and more so in the 1980s and beyond. And for example, I look at policy innovations within a progressive prefectural government in Japan, as well as the emergence of new Japanese NGOs involved in Asia. From, I guess, an ideational perspective, I also look at the activism and writings of Tsurumi Yoshiyuki, a really fascinating individual who wrote prolifically on, war responsibility and Southeast Asia. And what I try to emphasize in this part of the book is how dramatically differently some progressive intellectuals and activists were imagining Asia by the 1980s. So early on, as I explained, the overwhelming image of Asia was one of stagnation. Then it became a symbol of liberation. Later in the 1960s, it became the site of Japanese transgression in the past and the present. But in the 1980s, some progressives start to approach Asia as a place to learn from. In other words, as they more deeply comprehended the realities in Asian countries, the region also began to function for them as a kind of spark for reflexivity and action aimed at, I guess, refashioning post-war Japanese identity, democracy, and external relations. So Asia, in the words of one activist, came to be seen as a teacher for Japan. To know the region was also to know the self, of course, as a consumer, as a citizen, as an Asian even, and of course, as an individual responsible for the human rights of others. And Tsurumi Yoshiyuki is a classic example of this for me. So he mounts a critique of Japanese modernity, nationalism, and capitalism by juxtaposing Japan against what he calls the flexible cultures of Southeast Asia, built around mangrove swamplands and not based on exclusivist nationalism and the rigid definition of national boundaries. Now, he certainly had a very idealistic vision of Southeast Asia, and I'm sure many Southeast Asian specialists would take issue with some of his arguments. But the important point about him, I think, is the way he turned or tried to turn the dynamic of Asia and Japan on its head. No longer was it Japan sort of leading Asia out of the darkness of stagnation. Rather, it's about Asia teaching the Japanese about genuine humanity and genuine coexistence with nature. It's certainly an idealized vision, as I said, but it's also an interesting intellectual shift from the idea of Asia as stagnation in the early post-war, indicating, for me, some really important things about the progress of this process of deimperialization. Okay, so I'm drawing to the end of my discussion. Just let me talk a little bit about the final part of my book, where I look closely at the rising discourse on East Asian regionalism and East Asian community among some Japanese progressives and many others during the 1990s and 2000s. So drawing on the model of European community, some at this time began to imagine a similar community emerging in East Asia, what some called a common house of East Asia. In the most kind of quixotic of visions, some even proposed the creation of a new USA, a United States of Asia, involving Japan, China, the two Koreas, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Quite an amazing idea. This was the economist Marishima Michio. What is important for me in this discourse is that it symbolized how progressives, I guess, were beginning to reimagine Japan's future within the symbolism of Asian community. In effect, trying to step out from beneath the long shadow and, indeed the weight of the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. And thanks to the long process of deimperialization, these new visions of East Asian community they were not based on Japanese leadership at all. In fact, proponents argued that, if Japan was to be genuinely integrated into Asia, the Japanese first and foremost needed to recognize the depth of the scars their country left on its neighbors and the ways these experiences were, I guess, kind of knit into the very core of those people's collective identities. Also, as you can see on the slide, in the 1990s and 2000s, we also witnessed the publication of much new scholarship on Asia. And I think there was a conscious intent in a lot of this work to try and position Japan within its region, both historically and in the contemporary era. So this is the discussion on which I end the book, and I guess I'm sort of ending on a note of hope here. The sense that positive change is possible, even if it's never complete, and even definitely if it is always vulnerable to the forces of revision and reaction. And I think that the rise of discourses about Asia, along with movements in the 1990s for historical reconciliation, are definitely used as ammunition by the right to mount their revisionist campaigns thereafter. So, the discursive field hardly becomes any less complicated. All right, so just a couple of final words. Coming back to my key terms in the book: deimperialization, civic activism, and national identity. In terms of deimperialization, as I've briefly outlined today, coming to terms with colonial empire and militarism was a long and somewhat tortuous process for Japanese progressives, but change did happen. And through this change, I think it became possible for some of them to imagine Japan differently, to rediscover the region, and to reimagine Japan's place in that region, even within a regional community. In terms of civic activism, I think that re-engaging with Asia certainly helped Japanese to face their past, but it also helped them to kind of reflexively examine what Japan had become in the post-war era. Moreover, acting in Asia, I think, also became another conduit by which the values and norms of global civil society, like human rights, sustainability, diversity, etc., could be absorbed and injected back into Japanese civil society more generally. So Asia really does become a teacher for Japan, and hence the the hierarchical dynamic of Asia Japan in modern Japanese history is, at least in these circles, turned on its head. And then thirdly, with regards to national identity, I think the process of deimperialization also shows how progressives slowly began to chip away at the deeply entrenched consciousness of ethnic homogeneity in post-war Japan. They certainly by no means overcame it. I'm not trying to say that. But I suggest that, through their activism and through their ideas, discussions about diversity within the nation. In other words, the idea of Asia within Japan started to become a topic of discussion where it had not been so before. And importantly, too, I think over time, this discussion of diversity and national identity among Japanese progressives also incorporates many more ethnic voices. Okay, so I will end there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Apologies in advance. My internet connection is not stable, so if something happens to me, Robert is agreed to take over moderating duties. But first, we'd love to have Robert's comments and questions. So,
okay. Thank you, Seiji, and thank you, Simon, for the chance to do this. And thanks to the Modern Japanese History Association and everybody in the audience. I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible. First off, because I have pages of questions I could ask you, and I could go on all night. And also, I think the members of the audience will probably have more interesting things to say than I will. First, I'll just say I admire the ambition to trace, the Asia problem through the post-war period in its entirety. In my book, I tried to do, the China problem, what Japanese, said about the PRC in basically 1 decade. So when I think about, how much I went through, how much I left behind, how much I never got to, it's a bold undertaking, and I think presented very persuasively. I'll also try to keep my comments, relate them to sort of my own research, and I apologize ahead of time to the audience if this seems kind of self-indulgent, but it will help me sort of focus here. Some of the things I found most interesting about the book, and especially that sort of made me think about the limits of my own research. One is the focus on the Asia within. I think this is really interesting. The focus on non-Japanese Asians in Japan. and how their participation in discussions of the Asia problem became really important. And I think it's pretty compellingly argued that that this was important, that forced progressives to go from kind of speaking for the Asia within to being challenged by the Asia within, sort of in the case of the Li Jinwu case that you mentioned, but also uh, the Kakyo Toso Iinkai, this Chinese student association in Japan that really took the New Left student movement to task for their views of Asia. So finally, in the case of people like Kang Sang-jung, the Asia within being equal participants in the construction and dialogue about Asia. So I thought that was a really important contribution to the book. Another one is this, what you mentioned, this dialogue with Asia and kind of re-engagement with Asia. I think for me, perhaps the most interesting chapters of the book were chapters 4 and 5 on we don't know Asia and getting to know Asia, and then the development of this Asian grassroots civic activism, the initiatives of local governments and NGOs to deal with Asians in Asia, and the way that informed the debate on the Asia problem. And this is something that's, it's kind of scratched an itch that I've had since I wrote my own book, that, I stopped my story in about the China problem at the end of the 1970s. And by that time, for the PRC, Japanese hadn't really had this chance to engage with people from the PRC. That only comes later in like the 1980s. And so I've always kind of felt that, in my book, that the Japanese and even the Chinese could kind of imagine the other, come up with their narratives of Sino-Japanese relations and come up with their views of China or Japan uh, in ways that really gratified their identity and didn't really challenge their identity without much in the way of what we might call negative feedback from the other. And so I always kind of had this idea in my mind that a lot of the reconciliation, if you want to call it that, between Japan and the PRC in the 1970s was really built on this kind of uh, fact that they didn't really have to deal with each other in a very sustained way. And perhaps part of what explains the breakdown of relations in the more, or maybe the more tense relations in the 80s and 90s, is the fact that this feedback mechanism uh, begins to operate. So I found this really interesting in a way to think about my own research. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask as well. They're fairly broad. I'll try to keep them brief. And they mostly have to do with the concept of deimperialization and how to use it. I thought it was very interesting. The first quote of the book that juxtaposes, decolonization and deimperialization. That decolonization is what the former colonizers have to go through. Deimperialization is what for former colonial peoples have to go through. Deimperialization is what the former colonizers have to go through. And so my first question about deimperialization is deimperialization teleological? It sounds in the book like deimperialization is a kind of a normative program that has a end, a telos, in which the Japanese will be reflective, repentant, and this will lead to reconciliation with Asia. And that is the solution to the Asia problem. I want to, say here, I'm not saying that, historians shouldn't have normative programs. Okay, but the question is this teleological, or is deimperialization an historical process that is more open-ended or open to contestation. I might be able to maybe make my point of what I'm getting at here a little bit better if we compare it to decolonization. We can think about decolonization as a teleological project, right? That decolonization is a political program, or that leads to an end. That end could be, an independent nation state. It could be, if you want to problematize the nation state or undermine the nation state, it could be perhaps, I don't know, a liberal, inclusive society. In intellectual or cultural terms, decolonization could be, some end in which the formerly colonized are sort of liberated or no longer shackled by intellectual or cultural constructs created by the former colonizing power. But we can also recognize decolonization as a historical process that's a lot more complicated, perhaps more ambivalent, a process in which all of these hypothetical ends I just threw out there off the top of my head are contested. And the former colonized people themselves are contesting these. And that this historical process can lead to not just a teleological end, but can lead to a multiplicity of decolonial or post-colonial alternatives. And so my question then is deimperialization teleological, or is deimperialization similarly open to alternative or contested ends? A second question then kind of builds off this. If deimperialization can be thought of as a kind of more open-ended historical process rather than an end, could we apply the concept of deimperialization to studying changes in thought and activism beyond the progressives? And I know this is beyond the scope of the book, but just as a general historiographical question, are non-progressives part of the history of deimperialization in Japan? And just to bring up sort of an example from my current research, could we apply this concept of deimperialization to my current research, which is on Cold War Japan-Taiwan relations? And the people I run into and study in my sources who are creating and engaging with Taiwan during the Cold War are not progressives. Quite the opposite, in fact. Most of them are self-conscious opponents of the progressives. People like Suzuki Akira and Kase Hideaki, who are self-consciously creating a narrative of Asia, China, and Taiwan in competition or opposition to the progressives. When I was reading chapter 4 on We Don't Know Asia and getting to know Asia, I couldn't help thinking about, in 1974, Suzuki Akira wrote a book called Daremo Kakanakata Taiwan, the Taiwan nobody writes about, in which he's doing exactly this. He's castigating Japanese, especially progressives, that they don't know anything about Taiwan. Incidentally, the subtitle of the book is Dansei Tengoku no Nani Takusareta Shinjitsu. So the truth that's hidden by the name Dansei Tengoku. So he's bringing up the sex tourism to Taiwan. So he's trying to challenge this as well. And so my question here is, are these people, are they part of the history of de-imperialization in Japan, or are they completely removed from it? And if they're part of the history, how are they part of the history? Are they the antagonists? Sometimes they seem to come up this way in the book, that historical revisionists or the new Asianists, I think you talk about later on in the book, are, appear and force progressives to sort of elaborate or change or develop their ideas. So are they the antagonists? Are they unintended consequences? Is it useful to use deimperialization for talking about these other people, these non-progressive or people who aren't progressive? finally, this one might be a little bit even more kind of self-indulgent here, but sticking on the topic of Taiwan, I noticed that Taiwan didn't come up very much in the book, and I suspect I know why this is. I suspect that in my sort of limited research that I've conducted so far, progressives don't seem to talk about Taiwan very much, especially, in the early post-war period. And I was just wondering if that's what you found as well. But in this case, you can't really, this avoidance of Taiwan can't really be explained by sort of lack of contact, that the Asia within Japan does include Taiwanese, okay? And not just Taiwanese, as in the case of the Kakyo Toso Iinkai that we talked, Seinen Toso Iinkai that we talked about before, who fit into sort of the left. They challenge the left on war responsibility, but not sort of on these broader leftist progressive ideological spectrum. But there are also Taiwanese in Japan, like the Taiwan Seinensha, which would later go on to be the Taiwan Dokuritsu Renmei, that was formed in 1960 at Meiji University. That's a Taiwanese independence group that later goes on to become WUFI, the World United for Muslims for Independence. You've got people like Thomas Liao or Liao Wenyi, who is the self-proclaimed head of the Republic of Taiwan Provisional Government in Japan until 1965. And perhaps more importantly, people like Su Bing or Shirming, who's a Marxist, a former Chinese Communist Party member, would-be assassin of Chiang Kai-shek. Some people have called him the Che Guevara of Taiwan, and he's in Japan. He writes his 400-year history of the Taiwanese, publishes it in Japan in 1962. And so my question is, do you know if the progressives you looked at ever came into contact with them? Do you have the same perception I have, that they kind of tried to avoid engaging with this, and sort of that's a sort of open-ended question. I'll leave it there, and hopefully that'll leave enough time for audience Q&A as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. Simon, would you like to respond? And then we
Yes,
can open up the
absolutely.
Q&A.
Absolutely.
Great.
So, yeah, some terrific comments and questions there. And thank you so much, Robert, for doing this today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for laboring through the book.
It was a joy.
Yeah, so just a couple of comments. Yeah, in response to your comments on the question of the Asia within, that was really something that I wanted to stress throughout the book. And I think that one of the interesting developments I see over time, definitely among progressives, is a growing awareness not only of the fact that when we're thinking and dealing with problems of Asia, it's not only about Japan and the Asia outside, but it's also the Asia within. And this recognition of that, which, as I explained through various case studies and events from the late 1950s onward, over time it develops from a sense of, we need to do something for the Asians within Japan to, hang on a second, we're not giving them a voice. And I think it's that there's an interesting shift there, in the sense of about questions of agency more than anything else. And yeah, I mean, again, it's not it's not a problem that's solved in the academy or in in movements, but it's certainly a growing awareness about that, the desire to bring voices of those Asians within Japan into the debate over time. So Asians within Japan speaking for themselves, certainly something that I noticed as I was moving through time. On the issue of not knowing Asia and the 1970s, yeah, I'm really glad that you like chapter 4 and chapter 5. I enjoyed writing those probably the most. And I think looking back now, the reason I particularly like the period from around the late 60s into the early 1970s is precisely because I see it as an interesting turning point in terms of not only engagement with Asia at the grassroots, but also a kind of broader transformation within Japanese civil society itself. And that 1970s moment is, it's a point in time where activists, like Oda Makoto and others who had been involved in the Vietnam War sit down and start to think about, what have we been doing over the past 4 or 5 years? And, what can our, how have we actually come to interact with Asia during these years? And they reached the conclusion that, we've been acting in the name of Vietnamese, we've been acting in the name of fellow Asians, but we really don't know anything about Asia. And there's a really interesting incident. Oda Makoto is involved in a movement for Asian detainees, Koreans who are going to be returned to Korea. So they go to the Omura detention center, and they're outside the detention center, and the Koreans who are going to be sent back to Korea are inside. And Oda sort of has this moment of awakening, and he says, just weeks earlier, I had been out protesting against an American, warship or something, and I was able to speak English. But here I am outside the Omura detention center, and I don't even know a word of Korean, and Korean is the closest, nation to Japan. And so there is this awakening that, who the hell do we think we are? What right do we have to be claiming to be representing Asians when we don't even know anything about them? And so I think that 1970s moment is really, really interesting in that sense, because what had sort of been abstract sort of starts to become more concrete in terms of the, that recognition or realization that we need to actually make some contact. And that then sort of leads on to really other interesting kinds of developments later on, when people like Tsurumi Yoshiyuki travel to Southeast Asia, and they sort of go native when they get there, and their whole ethos becomes, you have to actually embed yourself in the culture, otherwise it's all abstract. And so the 1970s in that sense I see as a really interesting inflection point. Coming back to your questions, I don't know how well I can answer them, but let me give it a go. Deimperialization. So what was it about? Is it normative? Is it a historical process? So I think two things came to mind as you were asking that question. The first reason I thought deimperialization might be useful was because, on the one hand, the book is about the question of how progressives deal with their growing sense of complicity in the past, and how does that growing sense develop or change over time. And I didn't think decolonization encapsulated that process as well as the idea of deimperialization did, in terms of refocusing it back onto the side of the former colonizer.
It makes sense.
I guess the other aspect of deimperialization from a historical perspective, and let me know if this doesn't make any sense, but it's not only about the question of dealing with responsibility for certain events that happened in the past. It's also about changing a mentality surrounding the nature of how Japan has been imagined within its region. And what I'm talking about here is a hierarchical notion of Japan leading Asia in a sense. And that positioning, I think, that positioning of Asia and Japan, that hierarchical positioning, is also another historical aspect that deimperialization, or this process of deimperialization is something that I sensed progressives were trying to work through. Actually, in a sense, it's a question. It's about themselves in many ways. It's about where do we put ourselves in this world and in this region. So it's reflexive in a sense. It comes back to a question of national identity. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of why I thought deimperialization could be interesting, because it deals with this question of not only the past and dealing with problems of the past, but also dealing with the question of how we have traditionally positioned ourselves within our region. One thing I did want to mention that you mentioned in your comments is that you said you deal only with the China problem, and I deal with the whole Asia problem. Well, I think I need to make a comment on that. You deal with China in your book, The China Problem, in a far more broad. I mean, you're covering conservatives, you're covering progressives. So I guess your vision is far wider. My Asia problem focus is only on progressives. So I'm keeping a very narrow focus. That's why I guess I was able to do it. Coming to your second question, could deimperialization be applied to non-progressives? And I think so. And I think it connects to perhaps some of the content and material that I deal with in the final chapter. And it's something I also mentioned when I was talking about deimperialization a moment ago. And it's that question of how do we situate Japan in its region? And where does Japan belong? What is its role in East Asia with Southeast Asia? And maybe it's not so closely related to, I'm sure, conservatives themselves are not thinking about deimperialization, but the question beating at the heart of deimperialization for me about this question of where does Japan belong, where is it positioned, is certainly one that conservatives themselves are dealing with. Now, some of them, like Ishihara Shintaro or others like that, are still saying that Japan should be right there at the top. But still, the question of positioning is certainly relevant for conservatives. Also, just a few more words on conservatives as well. Throughout the book, I guess one thing, if I was rewriting the book now, one thing I would actually stress even more is that it's very often conservatives and the business world or the business community that is actually leading the way in terms of reconnecting with Asia in the post-war era. I mean, they're back there in Southeast Asia. They're out there with ODA and those sort of things well before progressives are starting to think about Asia. And I think that sort of catches many progressive activists by surprise, particularly the kind of complaints they start to hear from Southeast Asia in the early 1970s when Japanese business starts to move back into the region. So and if you can even go back to Bandung as well. It's conservatives leading the way there back to Asia. So yeah, the role of conservatives is very, very important, and I purposely did not deal with them in the context of this, this problem of deimperialization in the book. Other colleagues here at the ANU and elsewhere, Andrew Levitas and Reto Hoffman, are doing really great work on that. So and I won't blab on any further. To try and answer your question about Taiwan, or why not Taiwan, I have one simple thing to say, and that is I don't know. Taiwan didn't come up, and maybe that's a blind spot for me. I should have, now that you mention it to me, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I should have been asking that question as I was going along, but I don't know. It was a silence, therefore I missed it, right? But it raised such an interesting question, and I don't know why.
Okay.
I think your explanation is probably the most convincing.